moi j'ai travaillé, c'est celle de Piaget. Et puis l'anthropologie de l'imaginaire avec Durand, etc. Bon. Si on part de Piaget, Piaget, avec son approche d'épistémologie génétique, essayait de comprendre l'émergence des représentations. Il était plus particulièrement intéressé par l'émergence des représentations logico-mathématiques, formelles, etc. Mais avant d'arriver là, il commence par nous dire que la première appréhension du monde est sensorimotrice, la perception et l'action. Il nous dit ensuite que ce qu'il appelle les schèmes sensorimoteurs, on pourrait rapidement dire que le schème est la structure dynamique du geste ou la forme de l'interaction, la forme de l'interaction. Ces schèmes s'intériorisent en images. C'est la naissance du symbole chez l'enfant. Lorsque ces schèmes ont une suffisante autonomie, il y a la possibilité pour l'enfant d'associer le schème à d'autres objets. Le schème, l'image devient indépendante de la présence de l'objet. L'image devient indépendante de la présence de l'objet et peut être associée à d'autres objets. Exemple que nous donne Piaget dans un de ses livres. Une petite fille peut jouer à la poupée avec un chiffon ou avec un oreiller. C'est possible parce que la structure du geste, le schème doux qui est caractérisé par le doux, l'enveloppe, la possibilité de tenir comme ça, etc. Il y a une homologie de la structure de l'objet qui permet que le schème puisse se déplacer. Excusez-moi, je suis fatigué, ça me prend plus de temps que ça d'habitude pour expliquer. Ce que je veux dire, c'est que si on voyait tout d'un coup une petite fille jouer à la poupée avec une table, nous n'aurions pas besoin d'avoir fait de la psychologie pour voir qu'il y a quelque chose qui ne va pas. D'ailleurs, on n'en a jamais vu. Avec une table, des enfants de 3, 4, 5, 6 ans, même un peu plus des fois, ils jouent à la maison, à la grotte, à la tente. Il suffit qu'il y ait une nappe ou qu'on rajoute une couverture. Parce que le schème d'interaction est évidemment, quand on n'est pas très grand, la capacité de se mettre dessous, de se protéger, etc. Et donc, on ne peut pas faire n'importe quoi, on ne peut pas produire n'importe quel imaginaire avec n'importe quel objet ou n'importe quelle chaîne. Ce qui est intéressant aussi, c'est que quand on continue avec Piaget, ces images continuent à s'intérioriser dans un processus d'intériorisation et d'abstraction en langage. En langage mytho-poétique d'abord, puis en langage formel, conceptuel. Ce processus d'abstraction est toujours, depuis son origine, ancré sur l'interaction sensorimotrice, sur le schème gestuel. C'est évidemment ce processus que Piaget va beaucoup plus développer que les questions d'imaginaire, etc. Plus précisément dans l'émergence des stades hypothético-déductifs, etc. Gilbert Durand, qui a repris en grande partie la dynamique piagétienne, dit que ce processus qui va du geste à l'image, au langage puis au concept, est un processus d'abstraction que Bachelard aussi avait décrit, qui consiste finalement à épurer la représentation de toute, c'est impossible, mais du maximum d'expérientiel. Durand appelle ce processus un processus de cristallisation. rappelé les travaux de Atlan, entre le cristal et la fumée. Une image est porteuse de beaucoup plus de polysémie. Ça ne veut pas dire qu'elle dit n'importe quoi, je crois l'avoir expliqué. Mais déjà, quand notre ami nous a fait un commentaire, il a réduit la polysémie. Et plus tu pourrais conceptualiser et définir l'opération, ce qui a au cœur de ça, pour arriver à une formulation conceptuelle qui aurait, dans le processus, perdu au final une grande partie de la dimension expérientielle. Elle aurait gagné en précision, elle aura perdu en communication, c'est pas le bon mot, mais c'est plus précis, mais il y a beaucoup moins de gens qui comprennent, pour faire les choses simples. Ce qui est intéressant chez Durand, c'est que du coup, il nous montre que le mythos et le logos ne sont pas déconnectés l'un de l'autre. Finalement, il arrive à dire que toute formalisation scientifique est une cristallisation d'une orientation symbolique. Il va ainsi parler, je vais essayer de faire les choses un peu... Enfin, j'ai combien de temps encore? Non.
On va faire un peu.
Il va... Durand va... il faut que je fasse un détour pour expliquer ça. Son travail a consisté en grande partie à rassembler les symboles et les images recueillis dans l'anthropologie religieuse, l'anthropologie du sacré, et dans les mythes, etc., et à les associer par homologie. Ce qui fait qu'il a eu une espèce de travail topographique. Il appelle ça comme une cartographie. En rassemblant les images qui étaient homologues et qui étaient associées dans les mythes, il a eu des zones qui se sont dessinées, essentiellement 3 zones, qu'après coup il a connecté avec la réflexologie. La première. Symboliques sont littéralement ancrées dans la forme du corps humain. Il parle d'anthropologie symbolique en disant que pour lui l'anthropologie c'est la recherche des constances de sens pour l'être humain. Vous voyez en quoi ça peut nous aider à penser quelque chose de transculturel. Pour lui ces constances de sens sont, une fois qu'il a eu ces 3 zones là, il les a directement liées à ce qu'on appelle les réflexes dominants dans la réflexologie, mais aussi finalement à la structure, à la forme du corps humain et aux gestes fondamentaux de l'humain. Le premier régime, il considère qu'il y a 2 régimes, c'est ça, Durand. Il y a 2 régimes de l'imaginaire, un régime diurne et un régime nocturne. Et il y a 3 schèmes. Le régime diurne est caractérisé par le schème de la distinction, qui est directement lié, dans l'hypothèse de Durand, à la station debout. Ce geste de se dresser, d'être un être vertical. Vous vous rappelez, la notion de schème, c'est la forme même du geste, la forme de l'interaction. Qu'est-ce qui caractérise le schème de la station debout? C'est un effort. c'est un effort, c'est une opposition entre le haut et le bas. C'est un effort qui tend à l'opposition. Okay, Gilbert Durand appelle ce schème le schème héroïque, parce que c'est un effort, et schizomorphe, parce qu'il sépare. Déjà dans sa forme même, mais en plus avec ses corrélations, parce qu'on se lève le matin depuis l'aube de l'humanité, même si aujourd'hui avec les éclairages, ça peut... mais on ne se lève pas sans lumière. C'est-à-dire que ce schème est associé à la vision, à la distinction, à la lumière. L'opposition, on se dresse vers la lumière, les lumières sont célestes, le soleil, la lune, etc. C'est un geste qui oppose les ténèbres du bas aux lumières d'en haut. Cette structure-là va s'associer toute une constellation symbolique de l'envol, de la liberté, de celui qui s'oppose héroïquement aux chaînes du destin. Le mythe de la caverne de Platon est magnifiquement une illustration de ce schème ascensionnel qui oppose les ténèbres du bas dans une verticalisation. Une autre manière de dire ça, de comprendre que le symbolisme réfère directement au geste anthropologique, autrement dit que le symbole, signifie par sa forme même et signifie par résonance harmonique avec les structures de l'être humain. Une autre manière de montrer ça, c'est de voir combien il est facile de traduire des contes et des légendes. Il est très difficile de traduire de la poésie, parce qu'elle joue avec le signe sémiotique conventionnel de la langue, la littérature. Mais les contes et les légendes sont très faciles à traduire, parce qu'ils signifient par les gestes et les formes mêmes des animaux et des éléments qui sont présents dans le conte. Lorsqu'on raconte l'histoire de quelqu'un qui se dresse ou qui gravit une montagne, on parle à tous les êtres humains de la verticalisation. Le simple fait de dire se dresser, se tenir droit, est chargé positivement. Alors que d'un point de vue logique, ça ne désigne qu'un mouvement équivalent à celui de ramper, par exemple. Ça n'est pas équivalent. Si on met, se dresser n'est pas le... Alors ça c'est important parce qu'on y viendra. Transculturel ne veut pas dire qu'il y a aussi la question des cultures. J'étais à un colloque sur l'auto-formation à Montréal où on a eu une présentation d'images pour représenter l'auto-formation. Elles étaient toutes, il y avait une série de 150 diapos, c'était toutes des diapositives de sportifs des Jeux Olympiques d'Atlanta dans des positions d'envol, héroïques de dépassement. Excuse-moi Steve et Martin, mais c'était une communication d'un collègue des USA et je disais, c'est très marqué culturellement. Ce n'est pas le seul imaginaire de la formation. On va aller au plus nocturne, il y a un autre imaginaire de la fusion, de l'intériorité qui était un peu évoqué dans un autre de nos blasons. Cet imaginaire de l'intériorité du centre est directement lié à un autre geste fondamental, c'est l'avalement, la succion, l'assimilation. Se nourrir. Se nourrir, c'est devenir ce qu'on mange. C'est un geste de fusion. sans parler de la fusion avec la mer, etc. Bon. Toutes les mythologies, les symboles de la boisson, de boire à la source, etc. Se nourrir, c'est un geste qui va vers l'intérieur, dans les ténèbres. On a des associés au labyrinthe, aux grottes, etc. S'intérioriser, c'est une toute autre affaire que se dresser. Là aussi, il y a toute une constellation, je peux pas... Mais vous voyez, c'est un geste dont le schème est fusionnel, intérieur, nocturne. Il n'y a plus de distinction entre le sujet et l'objet. Il n'y a pas de... Et Durand a l'habitude de placer entre les deux le schème de l'articulation qui correspond pour lui au geste de la reproduction. Là aussi, c'est un schème gestuel d'une toute autre nature, qui n'est ni la séparation ni la fusion, mais l'articulation des contraires dans le temps. Parce que la reproduction a à voir avec les cycles des générations, les cycles de la procréation, les cycles des saisons, du mûrissement. Le schème de la reproduction nous renvoie au schème des germinations, des morts et des renaissances, des cycles. C'est un geste à la fois cyclique et rythmique, qui est très bien représenté dans le Tai Chi Quan, le symbole du Tao, où les polarités s'engendrent mutuellement dans le temps, dans un mûrissement temporel. C'est encore une autre manière d'articuler les polarités. Ajoutez à ça que pour Durand, ces trois régimes ne sont pas des choses qu'on peut séparer, mais sont à concevoir dans une logique comme celle de Lupasco. C'est-à-dire que lorsqu'un des schèmes s'actualise, il ne le fait que en potentialisant, sur le fond des autres. Et c'est sans arrêt dans une... on pourrait dire rapidement que... Parce que pour lui, l'âme humaine est tigrée, il dit. Elle est plurielle, elle est tigrée. C'est la... Si on est uniquement... C'est le problème du déséquilibre des imaginaires sociaux, d'ailleurs, qu'il travaille beaucoup depuis. Lorsqu'une société va actualiser de manière très monolithique un des schèmes, ce qui est en partie le cas de la société moderne, qui s'est largement... la civilisation moderne qui s'est largement développée autour du schème diurne, des oppositions, des séparations, des distinctions, etc. Il y a nécessairement un moment de saturation qui fait que d'autres cycles. Alors, vous voyez que cette dynamique-là de l'imaginaire, elle est à la fois personnelle, sociale ou culturelle, à différents niveaux, et anthropologique. Ça ne veut pas dire, donc, ouais, je pense que ça peut peut-être nous aider à poser quelques repères pour comprendre qu'à la fois il y a quelque chose de trans au sens de qui passe au-delà, à travers, entre les personnes, les cultures ou les disciplines, mais que à condition de pouvoir permettre le croisement ou l'échange des points de vue ou pas des points de vue du moment de l'actualisation de chacun des personnes ou des cultures en présence. C'est pour ça que je voudrais arriver à la notion de cercle et peut-être m'arrêter là-dessus parce que je commence à... Je pense que j'ai été beaucoup aidé, plus que je ne l'imagine, même plus que j'en suis conscient, par mon immersion dans dans des cultures amérindiennes. Parce que ce que je vous dis là, c'est finalement après 20 ans que je formule ça, mais j'avais pas réalisé à quel point c'était, ça m'avait influencé. Quelques mots sur le cercle. D'abord, précisons tout de suite que ce n'est pas des mots qu'on entendrait dans la bouche d'un Indien. Le cercle, c'est un concept ou une notion amérindienne qui est vécue dans le tipi, dans le camp, dans les danses, dans le tambour, dans les mythes, qui est présent, qui est omniprésent. Alors je vais dire quelques mots sur le cercle de parole. C'est une pratique anthropologique ancienne. Ok. Un cercle se manifeste par un centre et une circonférence. Dans le cercle de parole, là, il y a un feu, puis quelques personnes autour. Chacun des membres, des participants au cercle, est lui-même un point. Alors, membre, on va dire, ça peut être une personne ou une culture si on essaye de penser transculturel. Chacun des membres d'un cercle est lui-même un point sur la circonférence à égale distance du centre. Chacun des participants a ainsi un point de vue sur le centre qui est tout à la fois unique, relié au centre par une vision directe, et nécessaire à l'ensemble pour que ce qu'ils appellent, quand ils prennent des décisions à l'unanimité, que le cercle se fasse. Il n'y a pas le point de vue à la fois unique, partial de chacun est nécessaire à ce que le cercle... Sur le cercle, aucun point de vue n'est prédominant et c'est l'unanimité des participants, dans le cas des décisions tribales, qui manifeste la cohérence du cercle. Ce n'est pas des décisions à la majorité. On peut se rappeler à cette occasion que dans ces cultures, le leadership n'est pas fondamentalement un statut, mais une fonction. L'aîné, c'est celui qui a la capacité à énoncer, à formuler le cercle, à produire l'unanimité. C'est un devoir, c'est pas un pouvoir. Mais il y a aussi le fait que chaque personne est traversée par cette circonférence. Une chose encore, dans ces cultures, et je tiens beaucoup à ce que, quand on parle de dialogue transculturel, on pense au dialogue avec ce qu'on appelle en anthropologie maintenant les cultures premières, parce qu'on n'ose plus les traiter de primitives. Au sens, on pourrait y revenir d'ailleurs sur les questions transreligieuses, je pense qu'ils ont beaucoup à nous apprendre, les cultures chamaniques, qu'on appelle aussi chamaniques. Simplement par le fait que ce sont des cultures qui ont, pour certaines, 40, 50 000 ans de transmission. Nous parlons de 40 000 ans de transmission. Et des cultures qui ont à la fois géré une transmission, une cohérence, et en même temps un changement, une capacité à transformer les rites étonnantes. Aussi des cultures où il n'y a pas de débat théologique entre les différentes personnes médecine sans parler de la relation à l'environnement. Je pense que en plus du fait qu'ils sont tous actuellement menacés de disparition, enfin en tant que culture, il me semble qu'ils sont importants à écouter. Une des choses que j'ai appris et qui m'a toujours posé question, c'est que pour eux, le cercle commence par, chaque personne est un cercle, un centre et une circonférence de toutes ces relations, mais chaque personne fait partie d'un cercle plus vaste, sa famille, les familles font partie d'un cercle plus vaste, la tribu, le clan, les gens qui partent, et puis finalement l'ensemble des humains, le cercle. Ça, c'est une notion que certains de nos philosophes ont développée, je pense à sociologue Elias ou Habermas ou d'autres gens comme ça. Ce qui est étonnant ici, c'est que le cercle ne s'arrête pas là. Le cercle, il va nous amener jusqu'au grand cercle. Je trouve que ça me permet de penser que c'est une certaine, au moins, analogie avec le cercle que dessine Bassarab. Ce grand cercle, il l'appelle, et je suis toujours très, très heureux d'entendre Bassarab expliquer comment il essaye de nommer le point, il l'appelle la grande chose mystérieuse. Parce qu'il ne s'arrête pas au cercle des humains, nous partageons quelque chose en commun avec les animaux. Nous sommes des vivants comme les plantes, nous sommes des étangs ou des êtres comme les pierres et les étoiles. Nous partageons même quelque chose avec les êtres invisibles. Ce cercle n'est pas limité, il est impensablement... Alors je trouve intéressant, moi, à titre personnel, que je vais revenir là vite sur mon affaire de cercle de parole, que certaines démarches de formation que je qualifie de post-modernes, je ne peux pas vous les citer toutes là parce que c'est pas une invention de moi, il y a beaucoup de choses qui sont faites en éducation permanente, les groupes d'histoire de vie, les ateliers de praxéologie, les groupes de co-développement professionnel, enfin énormément de choses qui se font dans le champ de la formation, disons post-moderne, retrouvent quelque part des démarches anté- ou pré-modernes. J'ai dit que je vais m'arrêter. Je peux encore faire 5 minutes, vous fatiguez. Hein. Je dois au moins faire ça pour boucler. Juste pour que vous pensiez bien que mon affaire ne se limite pas à cette histoire de symbolisme, mais elle est primordiale pour ce qu'on a pu vivre ensemble, c'est-à-dire l'expression du sens existentiel, de qu'est-ce qui nous rassemble. Mais il y a bien sûr d'autres cercles de parole qui peuvent s'appuyer sur d'autres niveaux de représentation. Là, j'emploie le terme de niveau de représentation au sens où, si j'ai bien compris, dans l'hypothèse transdisciplinaire, un niveau, c'est un ensemble cohérent de lois et de concepts qui ne peuvent pas passer à un autre. Hein. J'en vois 3, au moins, pour l'instant. Je travaille souvent mes groupes avec 3 niveaux. Ils sont reliés au schème qu'on a vu. Les dimensions du sens, signification, qui réfèrent à la raison formelle, finalement, qui consiste à distinguer, dont l'orientation générale dans la méthode consiste à accompagner la production de savoir théorique par réflexion sur l'expérience. Je ne peux pas tout développer. Je pense à Mirmont qui appelle ça les savoirs épistémés. Ce qui est quand on parle de niveau, si j'ai bien compris, il faut montrer en quoi il y a une cohérence qui peut pas, à la fois de concepts et de règles, de lois, qui sont spécifiques au niveau. Alors, c'est important quand même de regarder les critères et normes de validité de chacun de ces niveaux de représentation. En ce qui concerne le savoir formel, c'est la cohérence logique qui est le critère de validité. La consistance formelle. On dit un savoir épistémique, c'est Mirmont qui appelle ça les corpus des savoirs qui se tiennent par eux-mêmes et qui organisent la connaissance. Ça, épistémé, si je ne m'abuse, c'est une racine grecque qui veut dire qu'il se tient tout seul. On peut comprendre ça. Ça, c'est du savoir épistémique. Ça doit se tenir tout seul en dehors de ma présence. Mais là-dedans, il n'y a pas le savoir. Par exemple, il n'y a pas là-dedans mon savoir d'action, mon savoir pratique pour animer ça. Il n'y a pas non plus le niveau du sens existentiel ou symbolique que cette affaire a pour moi. Ok ? Mais donc c'est un certain rapport au temps. Le savoir formel, le niveau de représentation formelle, il a sa validité dans la consistance logique, la construction, et il se tient dans le temps tout seul. Ce qui a permis à Champollion, et puis maintenant aux égyptologues, de retrouver l'intégralité de lire les hiéroglyphes égyptiens et de retrouver ça. C'est une autre affaire de savoir comment ils montaient leur pyramide. Le savoir d'action est beaucoup plus incorporé. Ce niveau du sensorimoteur, de la raison pratique, ce que j'appelle la raison pratique, il a une toute autre cohérence. Son critère de validité n'est pas du tout la consistance ou la construction logique, c'est l'efficacité dans le flux. C'est le bon coup de main. C'est la bonne. Ce que je fais là, c'est à la fois essayer de transmettre de l'information formelle, mais c'est une pratique. Il vaut mieux que j'utilise une métaphore ou une formule pas très consistante logiquement mais efficace. Ok ? C'est une toute autre affaire quand il s'agit de... Il a aussi d'autres caractéristiques, il est très fortement sensoriel, incorporé. Bon. Je fais référence là aux travaux de Donald Schoen à Harvard, qui a beaucoup travaillé avec la question de la science-action sur la cohérence de ce savoir d'action. Il est en partie automatisé, il fonctionne de manière semi-consciente. Hein. Juste l'exemple qu'il donne très souvent, quand on sait faire du vélo, qu'on sait conduire une voiture, c'est justement qu'on n'y pense plus. C'est tellement automatisé que le bon praticien est celui qui a toute son énergie pour regarder, pour la mettre sur, ou le maximum de son énergie sur le contexte. Ok ? Ça ne veut pas dire que dès qu'il... Par contre, c'est pas automatique, c'est pas inconscient hein, au sens psychanalytique ou refoulé. C'est juste là en arrière-fond. Il suffit que le praticien rencontre une situation incongrue, ou le chauffeur il y a une plaque de verglas où il y a du brouillard, et tout d'un coup, nous réhabitons nos sens, notre sensorialité pour... Hein, c'est ce qui fait le bon praticien. Donc l'adhésion au flux, mais c'est très important dans la question, par exemple, des échanges de formation transculturelle, ou en tout cas, par exemple, dans celle que j'ai menée avec ATD Quart-Monde, avec les personnes du Quart-Monde, je ne vais pas trop vite, et les universitaires, il y avait des gens qui avaient le vécu d'expérience de la misère, il y avait des gens qui avaient le vécu de l'action, des gens qui s'étaient engagés auprès des pauvres, et puis des universitaires. Ce qu'il faut comprendre, c'est que le savoir formel, il est très facilement mobilisable, ce qui explique la logorée que nous pouvons développer. Il suffit d'un mot et Bassarab ou n'importe lequel des universitaires ici, Steve, Martin, Augusti, on peut mobiliser très facilement ce savoir. Le travail de production a déjà été fait. En ce qui concerne le savoir d'action, c'est une toute autre affaire. Si tout d'un coup on demande à Bassarab ou à Steve ou à Augusti ou à n'importe lequel d'entre nous, mais comment fais-tu pour réussir ? Comment réussis-tu ta pratique de la physique, etc. Les mots nous manquent pour dire notre agir. Ça suppose d'abord et c'est tout un travail qui a été développé par, je répète, Donald Schoen aux États-Unis, Vermeersch en France, etc., pour trouver des supports, des démarches compatibles avec ce type de savoir, pour lui permettre de s'exprimer. Entre autres, éviter les questions analytiques, mais plutôt poser des questions sensorielles sur des situations concrètes et singulières qui ont été réussies par le praticien. Je ne peux pas développer ça. Et là, je ne vais pas trop développer non plus, puisqu'il s'agit du niveau du sens symbolique. Mais ici, les critères et normes de validité du sens symbolique, il n'est pas dans la cohérence logique ni dans l'efficacité. Il est dans, moi j'appelle ça comme ça, des résonances harmoniques entre la personne et l'environnement. Ce qui signe la validité, c'est quelque chose comme une résonance harmonique. Que ce soit une vision dans une culture tribale ou un poème ou une chanson d'un chanteur populaire, il y a quelque chose qui va dans la forme, ce qui signe, c'est pas la cohérence logique. Je veux dire, pour un acteur, pour un créateur, il y a une production symbolique, ce qui va signer sa validité, c'est les résonances harmoniques qu'elle va produire. Et on n'est pas du tout dans le même rapport au temps, on est beaucoup plus dans un rapport synchronique. Bon, j'ai fait référence ici à la poétique de Bachelard ou à la synchronicité jungienne. Ok, ce que je voulais dire, c'est que le travail que je mène dans des cercles de parole, il est toujours un jeu entre ces trois dimensions du sens, des significations, de l'orientation de l'action et du sensible symbolique. Et qu'une grande partie du travail consiste aussi à pluraliser, à varier les supports de l'échange. Blason, récit de pratique, production de recherche ou de réflexion ou de conceptualisation de son action, etc. etc. Alors, bon, je vous donnerai le texte après où il y aura un peu les références de tout ça. Une dernière chose. Quel que soit le registre, il y a une démarche commune. Les supports sont différents. Les appréhensions des représentations sont différentes. Mais je vais juste faire deux dessins. Il y a quelque chose qui me semble commune à toutes les démarches dont je me suis inspiré, etc. C'est que le premier temps, c'est de proposer à chaque participant une réflexion, une boucle de rétroaction qui correspond à l'autoréférence, une rétroaction sur son expérience. Mais pas une rétroaction dans le vide, une rétroaction avec un support, le blason, le récit de vie, la production d'une problématique de recherche, un support. Évidemment, là je viens de citer 3 supports qui réfèrent à ça. Donc, laisser le temps permettre et donner les moyens et un outil de réflexivité et de production. Cette production devant être adaptée et cohérente à l'orientation dominante du groupe au moment où on travaille. Et le deuxième temps, c'est de mettre ces productions autour de la table. Ce qui se passe après, dans le croisement des productions, est aussi important. C'est pas juste on est gentil, on va échanger, on se donne tous la parole, etc. Mais quand dans un groupe de recherche, action, on échange sur nos problématiques, on met en commun nos problématisations de l'expérience, ou dans un groupe, comme on l'a fait tout à l'heure, plus sur le sens existentiel, où on met en commun nos symbolisations, ou encore dans un groupe d'action, qu'est-ce qui se passe ? C'est que tout ce que vous avez dit, ça élargit ou ça pluralise. Il y a quelque part, on a la possibilité de comment je dis ça, de décentrer son point de vue, ou en tout cas de voir apparaître la pluralité des problématisations possibles. les effets de cette mise en commun sont au moins aussi importants que les effets de la réflexivité impersonnelle. Parce que, bon, je ne peux pas rentrer trop là-dedans, mais si on s'en tient là, on peut aussi être dans la répétition. On peut avoir ce risque. Les deux vont ensemble. Je m'arrête. Je suis désolé pour... Est-ce qu'on a encore quelques... Si vous voulez avoir encore un peu de force pour des échanges.
Alô? Alô?
Oh, excuse-moi, j'ai oublié de dire, mais ceux qui étaient là l'année dernière l'ont compris, que c'est directement lié au travail que vous a présenté Gaston Pinault sur les trois sens du sens. Mais pour ceux qui ne le savaient pas, vous pouvez le trouver dans le premier...
Eu queria te dizer que eu fiquei muito contente de poder compartilhar com você essa experiência. Eu me sinto menos sozinha nesses círculos de reflexão. A nossa proposta, o nosso convite de experimento era experimentar uma situação, desenhar.
Expérimenter une situation, faire un dessin, une image de comment tu te perçois en voyant ce dessin, le dessiner, ensuite essayer ou imiter le dessin. O microfone.
Não.
É isso. É que ela está traduzindo.
Não, é porque lá outro que ouve não pode traduzir para outra pessoa.
Ah. Gente, não precisa traduzir, eu estou lendo isso aqui, ó. Está escrito. Eu estou lendo isso aqui para ele porque ela falou qual era a proposta de trabalho e falou o quanto essa proposta de trabalho está em ressonância com o que foi feito. Ah, vamos lá? Donc. Comment est-ce que tu éprouves Comment est-ce que tu éprouves cette suite de dessins? Fais un dessin ou une image de comment tu te perçois. Essaye maintenant d'imiter le dessin que tu as fait. Qu'est-ce qui te semble évident? Qu'est-ce que tu as perçu en imitant que tu n'avais pas perçu en dessinant?
Obrigada. Então, acho que nós estamos falando de círculos de recursividade. E eu te pergunto se depois de fazer o círculo de palavras, se você faz outros círculos de recursividade como você fez conosco. Esse é todo o nosso processo de avaliação, são círculos recursivos de reflexão, e que não passa só pelo pensamento, por uma produção de palavras, mas toda uma experiência que vai se transformando, escutando, experimentando as sensações, falando, olhando, e que vai mudando à medida que vamos interagindo.
Oui, ça dépend ça dépend du temps et des intérêts des personnes. Certains ateliers qui durent pendant 2 ans, on a traversé des moments sur le sens de ce qu'on faisait, d'autres moments qui étaient beaucoup plus centrés sur le développement des savoirs d'action, et à d'autres moments, souvent, la production réflexive et théorique de ce qui a été fait. Mais ça dépend de l'intérêt des groupes. Certains professionnels avec qui je travaille ne sont pas, au moment où je travaille, intéressés par la production d'une théorisation. Ce qu'ils veulent surtout, c'est par exemple le transfert des savoir-faire. Mais parfois, en faisant ça, après ils se disent « mais personne ne sait ce qu'on fait, il faut qu'on le dise ». Alors là, on commence à écrire.
Merci beaucoup. Il y a deux questions que j'aimerais bien que tu me donnes un certain éclairage en référence au cercle de parole que tu animes, en tenant compte de deux caractéristiques au moins, je ne sais pas si c'est ton expérience, mais c'était la mienne avec le Mohawk, c'est que dans ce cercle de parole, il y a deux caractéristiques qui d'abord peuvent nous surprendre ou même choquer. C'est que personne essaie jamais de convaincre personne de quoi que ce soit, et personne ne donne et personne ne demande pas de conseils. Ce qui, en soi, peut être même déroutant, mais qui, si on le regarde un peu plus profondément, au moins de mon point de vue, c'est que c'est une façon, au moins dans mon interprétation, qu'il s'agit de ne pas interférer dans le rythme de la réalité, mais de s'y accorder, de s'y harmoniser. Et ce qui pourrait sembler, d'un point de vue moderne, très louable de donner un conseil ou d'essayer de convaincre celui qui est dans l'erreur, ce qui ne veut pas dire qu'il ne peut pas penser que l'autre est dans l'erreur ou qu'il est en train de faire une bêtise, mais jamais, même dans des situations que j'ai assisté assez fortes et graves, il n'y avait pas de conseils qui étaient donnés, il y avait un respect total, même pour des options qui mettaient en danger l'harmonie du peuple, du cercle lui-même, et jamais de conseils à donner. Alors je ne sais pas si ces deux dimensions que j'ai découvertes qui étaient essentielles, qui m'ont vraiment mis dans une certaine paradoxe, s'ils sont présents aussi en quelque part dans le travail que tu fais.
Oui, là je ne veux pas développer sur le... Bon, tout à l'heure je parlais de 40 000 ans d'expérience, alors évidemment il y a une certaine subtilité dans les échanges qui nous déroute quand même. Mais ce qui est très étonnant, je dirais que ça dépend du type de savoir qu'on veut produire. C'est clair que quand un groupe se mobilise sur des savoirs formels, le débat y est. Ouais. Chacun avance sa construction, on est dans un débat. Pas quand on parle de savoir existentiel. De ce point de vue-là, j'ai essayé de formaliser quelques règles déontologiques aussi pour le formateur. Au moment où on ouvre un espace sur le sens existentiel, le formateur, il peut plus être donneur de conseils sur le sens existentiel. Il peut y avoir une disparité entre le formateur et les personnes qui viennent le voir sur de l'information, souvent, sur des savoirs formels. Il peut y avoir une disparité sur le savoir d'action, en tout cas le savoir d'action de faire médiatiser les échanges, mais sur le sens existentiel de ce qui se passe, je me borne le plus souvent à protéger les échanges, c'est-à-dire à négocier avec le groupe les règles minimum, l'absence d'analyse critique, c'est-à-dire on s'interdit pour que je puisse parler en confiance du sens existentiel que ça a pour moi de venir ici. Il ne faut pas que je sois sous le feu d'un sniper qui puisse me dire tu dis ça parce que... Je peux tout entendre. Je peux entendre que ce que je dis ou ce que mes symboles sont insupportable, mais toute personne qui peut parler en son nom. Ok ? Donc de ce point de vue-là, il n'y a pas de débat. Mais j'ai jamais eu besoin de faire d'efforts là-dessus. C'est quelque chose qui... Mais c'est pas une réponse.
Alguém mais? Bom, eu ia propor que a gente continuasse até às 5, depois caminhássemos juntos pela praia e voltássemos. Mas como ninguém tá disposto, até amanhã. Obrigado.
Vocês sabem que nós atrasamos o início dessa programação de hoje de manhã, por um motivo bastante justo, que foi essa exposição de fotografias da história da transplantariedade, mas o Rosenberg terá todo o tempo que ele precisa, as 2 horas que já estavam inicialmente conferidas para que ele proferisse a sua palestra. Depois nós faremos um intervalo de meia hora, e mais 2 horas de Patrick. Logicamente o almoço vai ser um pouquinho retardado, mas eu acho que a gente tem que ter essa flexibilidade para acolher as coisas como elas também vão acontecendo. A programação será cumprida, mas com uma decalagem de horário. Bem? Bom, Rosenberg?
Can you hear me all right? Can you hear me all right? Can you hear me all right now? Testing. How do I keep this? If I just put this here. Can you hear me now? Still no problem. You can. Okay. I had a much more ambitious talk planned for today. The purpose of the talk was to address transdisciplinarity directly by examining the role of metaphor in cross-disciplinary inquiry. And to argue, perhaps polemically, of the need to use the examination of the relationship between metaphor and epistemology as the basis for transdisciplinary inquiry. However, my original invitation from Maria de Mello concerned hypertextual or cyberspace, time and space. It should be fairly clear that when we talk about hypertext or cyberspace, time and space, that we're really talking about metaphors of computer environments. So that the issue of metaphors for the design and theorizing of cybernetic environments is a subset of the problem of metaphor in transdisciplinary inquiry to begin with. So I think the best thing to do is, as best I can, to try to kill 2 birds with 1 stone by moving inductively from examining metaphors of hypertext in particular, and then moving from this local concern of the application of metaphor to a more general concern with the role of metaphor in discourse, generally speaking, specifically for the purposes of transdisciplinary inquiry. And polemically, to argue for a need to be rigorous and responsible with the use of our metaphors as we do transdisciplinary inquiry. And in the process, I will try to talk about some hypertextual modeling of the relationship between metaphor and epistemology that I'm currently doing. Let's begin with metaphors and hypertext. I'm not going to talk about the history of hypertext because there are lots of books about that. Vannevar Bush's 1946 article, As We May Think, envisioned a way of organizing massive amounts of information by means of a concept which he called memex. And there are a number of other figures in the process, but what I would like to talk about are the nuts and bolts kinds of experiences that those of us in the academic world had in the mid to late 80s to the present, in order to suggest that the evolution of the use of hypertext environments is in part of the evolution of recourse to more sophisticated metaphors in order to structure these environments. Please interrupt me if there are any questions that you might have. I'd like to run this as an interruptible lecture because the first part of this paper, before I address the question of metaphor, generally speaking, is expository for the purposes of explanation. How many people have played with the World Wide Web in the room? About 60%, I think, 50-60%. The World Wide Web is nothing more than a huge hypertext. It is a global hypertext of linkages between not just data files, but other computers, which are themselves servers which connect to other servers, which connect to other computers, and in those computers are data files. The immensity of the hypertext of the World Wide Web is mind-boggling, and its growth is exponential. But the original hypertexts were built for standalone computers to organize information. The one I'm most familiar with is at that early stage was HyperCard, which was a tool, a self-authoring hypertextual tool made available for free for every single Apple user who purchases an Apple computer. During the dark days of Apple, it farmed out HyperCard to another company. It's no longer offered free, and perhaps it has become outmoded, but it was an extremely sophisticated hypertextual authoring tool, and in fact it's only with Java 3D and Macromedia Flash that web authoring for the World Wide Web has reached the level of sophistication that could be accomplished with the earlier standalone HyperCard environment. Is there a need to define hypertext? Just briefly, hypertext enables the sequential linkage of text to text. For example, in the academic and legal world, we use footnotes, correct? In a hypertext environment, one could construct an essay where instead of simple footnotes which point to endnotes at the end of the page or footnotes at the bottom of the page, you could click on a button where the footnote is and open up not just the bibliographical reference to the passage, but the actual entire text from which that passage is being referred to. And that text would have footnotes. I don't know what's going on. I'm going to have to figure out how to not make sure that... Yes. Yeah, this is really silly of me. Hopefully it will come on in a second. So not only can you have non-sequential access to texts to create a galactic image of thought, so that in terms of the extended hypertext of the World Wide Web, it has become customary to talk about the docuverse. I don't know if I can quickly
Never.
Do I have to reboot? You don't think I have to reboot? Okay.
It shouldn't.
Okay. Do you see what I'm saying? So the capacity to represent the range and subtlety of one's thought is more interesting to me because one can create visual models of relationships and therefore metaphors of the structures of thought within a discipline and between disciplines. But the title of my book, of which this is a part, not specifically metaphors of hypertext, but my more general concern about metaphors and discourse, is called Fables of Self-Organization. And I'm using the word fable in the sense that Giambattista Vico uses it, as a sense of the way in which we create metaphors, tropes, poetically in order to structure our coherence of the world, but then we often forget that we're the authors of the tropes that we use to organize the world, and we assume that the deities that emerge, whether secular or sacred, are in fact projections of our own poetic imagination. Fables of Self-Organization is the title of my book, and the subtitle is The Cultural Work of Complexity in the Avant-Garde. But in this talk, moving inductively from hypertext and metaphors of hypertext to metaphors generally speaking, I am concerned with how we make meaning for ourselves and how we lose the sense that we are the authors and creators of the metaphors that we make. So I'm going to try to briefly run through, in a sense, what as a kind of enigmatic history of hypertext. The first hypertext was designed as a Rolodex. to keep track of names and addresses, like you would have on a secretary's desk, correct? Or on anybody's desk. And then when it became obvious that you can integrate texts on the individual cards of hypertext, hypertext can be defined in terms of blocks of text called lexia. In the hypercard they're called cards or fields. Buttons, which can be placed on these lexia, and I'll talk about metaphors of buttons, one of which is portal, which I talked about with reference to metaphor before, and we'll come to this point later. And links. Texts are linked together by means of portals which enable transfer from one text block or lexia to another. Many of you may not have experience with the World Wide Web, but you probably do have experience with a word processing program, which itself is a hypertext. How many people have formatted an essay with footnotes? And notice that when you click on the number, you're taken to the end of the page. That's a hypertextual function. Only I'm talking about linkages to the entire work to which that number refers. And people are constructing these environments all the time. So once it became obvious that we could organize information and not just names and addresses, we used the metaphor of organizing our information for our activity as a desktop. And I think all of you have reference to the ways in which your computer is organized, and many of them even have a reference to desktop rather than hard drive, so that you could put things using the metaphor of the actual desk on your desk instead of in a drawer, which is really what your hard drive is. How you organize your drawers, I don't know about your drawers, but my drawers tend to look like salad. But many people use file cabinets, and in their file cabinets they organize the files in sections. If you're like my wife, it's according to alphabetical order, and then in each letter of the alphabet there are numbers, and under the numbers there are letters. She can be my savior sometimes. And of course what I'm describing is the trunk and branches and twigs of a tree, which is what I refer to as the arboreal structure of information, which we associate with division classification systems codified for the first time in the West in, forgive me for bringing rhetoric into this, is Aristotle's Rhetoric, where he first talks about the level of invention and the need to organize the information that we use in the kairos of a speaking situation, with reference to invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. Let me just point out in a parentheses that the world of rhetoric has been complicated greatly by reference to the words memory and delivery now, as you could probably imagine, because of the birth of these kinds of delivery systems and the ability to store enormous amounts of energy. This is already obsolete. This computer is already obsolete. It is an Apple G3 laptop. It has 400 megahertz operating chip. It has 192 megabytes of operating memory and 6 gigabytes on the hard drive. There are already 500 megahertz Apple computers which run twice as fast as Pentium 3s. So it would need a 1,000 megahertz Pentium 3 to run as fast as a 500 megahertz. And there are slides in the computer to have over a gigabyte of operating memory and 12 to 20 gigabytes on the hard drive. Imagine my very first computer, which when I could afford one was an Apple, a Mac, which had 4 megabytes of operating memory. Classic, 40 megabytes on the hard drive. And that was only because I finally got one because at the school I was at closed at midnight, and therefore I couldn't use their their Zenith well, anyway, you get the idea. So the problem with tree diagrams is that all disciplinary knowledge is organized according to tree diagrams. Disciplinary knowledge, division classification systems. And you probably remember my reference to Duchamp's pyramid. And of course I want to go back and forth, but I'll have to restrict my conversation. And there are limits, because how do you get from the twig and the branch emanating from the trunk of this discipline to the twig on the branch emanating from the trunk of this discipline? To use the same Vermont farmer joke is how do you get there from here? Which leads to my next comment, which is directly related to the metaphor of the rhizome. That I discussed yesterday. Now, where is my metaphor rhizome section? Hypertext as rhizome. Give me a break. Okay. What is rhizome? It is a horizontal structure of information rather than a vertical structure of information. And by reference to grasslands and fungus like I did, it suggests a way to cross disciplines horizontally in a way. And the question is how to do that. But remember the word fable, rhizome is a metaphor. Okay, so we are creating a way to think through the use of a metaphor. There are other metaphors besides trees and rhizomes, but we have to have a certain self-consciousness about the fact that we're employing this metaphor because it enables us to do some kinds of thinking but not others. Division classification systems enable us to think inside of a discipline, but it does not let us think outside of a discipline. The horizontal realm of rhizomatic thinking, of which many people have commented in terms of my own thinking as a kind of branch of a benign mandis, is itself an enabling metaphor for structuring information with its own restrictions. Always I'm going to come back to the word fable. Okay, so that we don't lose sight of the fact that we're creating these metaphors in order to do work, but we have to remember that we authored the metaphors, so the work that we do as a result of those metaphors are exactly what enable and restrict us from being free to think whatever we want. Gilles Deleuze, one of my favorite philosophers, said recently, not recently, but a long time ago, that philosophy is a discipline designed to keep people from thinking. And it was not a bad thing for a philosopher to say, I think, but I mean, what he's referring to is the fact that that we build disciplines and we build ways of thinking in order to enable, but that enabling process also creates boundaries. So examples of rhizomes, I've talked about this prairie grasslands and aggregating fungus. Remember my fungus that I named Henri, after Henri Poincaré and Henri Bergson up in the Upper Peninsula of New York? Neuroscience, the brain is grass, not a tree. Okay, parallel processing is a model that has become successful because it seems to replicate patterns of behavior of the human brain in ways that the old computational model could not do. Examples of rhizomes in culture. There was a wonderful dance group in America called Palabolus, and it was invented by a guy at Dartmouth whose father was a biophysicist, and he worked in his dad's lab, and the name Palabolus refers to a kind of rhizome, and Palabolus specialized in multi-human formations that would disintegrate and reform contingently, and they're very famous, and they're now no longer avant-garde, but in the mainstream. But that's another story, having to do with postmodern theory and complicity and that sort of thing. But let's not go there. So the inactive and distributed paradigms of cognitive science seems to provide scientific underpinning to an understanding of the significance of the rhizome as a metaphor, but then again the rhizome as a metaphor helped to clue cognitive scientists into how the brain might work. The popular source for the rhizome as a philosophical concept comes from Deleuze and Guattari, but let's not go there right now. Haven't you figured this out yet, Mr. Computer? Okay. So, a rhizome is opposed to what? Arboreal systems, division classification systems and databases, academic disciplines, corporate and military organizations, and you can see the reference to Duchamp's pyramid structure, which is the geometric form, 3D geometric form, which best represents division classification systems. So I've done the work to a certain extent yesterday with respect to self-organizing systems and Deleuze and Guattari, Ilya Prigogine, and Francisco Varela. So let me not go there either. Let me go on to the dangers of metaphor. Well, as you could probably imagine, as all of us that were playing in the late 80s and early 90s, we were talking about the freedom of hypertext. Oh, this is going to be able to liberate us, and the liberatory rhetoric of hypertext embraced the rhizomatic possibilities of hypertextual organization, of new forms of art. As you know, novels are being constructed in hypertext, and I have examples of hypertext novels here, but I'm trying to constrain my discussion by not opening up my division classification system so I can go to 1A parentheses and then end up talking 7 hours instead of 1.5. I hope no more than 1.5. But in any case, actually my early kind of career in writing about hypertext had to do with shutting down and making self-conscious the liberatory rhetoric by critiquing exactly the kinds of claims that people were making and showing that hypertext was no such animal and that there were constrictions for these metaphors that belied the liberatory rhetoric of hypertext theorists. And I made actually a number of, I'm afraid to say, enemies among the hypertext novelists like, well, I won't mention any names, but because of my attempt to rein in the liberatory rhetoric and the celebration by being careful about the metaphors that we use with respect to hypertext. So thinking about academic discourse as arboreal and rhizomatic, I think, is something that we need to face if we're doing transdisciplinary inquiry. So the question is, what does cyberspace got to do with it? And I'm also referring to, of course, the Tina Turner song, "What's Love Got to Do with It?" But so my own interest was in exploring as self-consciously as I could the rhizomatic nature of hypertext, and I designed the Rhizome project from '89 to '92, which actually modeled sequentially, step by step, heuristics, both creative and associative, as well as logical and linear thinking patterns, logical thinking patterns, for the purposes of writing arguments in freshman composition. In other words, I'm a rhizomatic kind of guy, but I'm also a theorist who's really interested in the question of praxis and theory. So I'm really interested in applying what it is that I do. I can demonstrate this another time, but I'm trying to cover a lot of territory, so let me go on. I also created, let me just simply point that hypertext seems to correspond to reversible systems because it has an overemphasis of geometric structure, while other environments like real-time contingent environments like chat rooms and MOOs, multi-object-oriented MOOs, multi-user domains, have the contingency of irreversible systems, which I talked about yesterday. I will put that aside because I'm hinting at physics metaphors, and I can't go there right now, but let me get there. I'm just taking a moment to talk about myself briefly, if that would be all right with you. So then I created a cluster of classrooms at the Media Lab at MIT in 1994 and actually taught classes linked to other classes at other universities where the students were able to meet and mingle and collaborate in the same place at the same time virtually, and we were able to bring in the authors of secondary works that we were reading for the course. The first course was the idea of intelligence, what's human about intelligence in science fiction and film, linked to another science culture studies course at Texas Tech, and I was at Eastern Kentucky University at this time. So MOOs are interesting because they allow contingent real-time functioning in cybernetic environments. The World Wide Web is interesting because it can do both. Okay? You can have an integration now of MOOs and websites. The World Wide Web is a static text situation, but there are ways of creating interfaces with things like WOOs, which are web-based MOOs, where you can carry on conversation. We can have this entire conference online if we wanted to, right now, with software downloadable over the World Wide Web that could be organized on a server at USPA, and you could set up a discussion list, put up a website, and in real time do everything we're doing here, with the exception of the wonderful contacts I've made personally, but I don't mean to denigrate online relationships. I never would have come to Brazil if it weren't for Leland McCleary. I never met Leland McCleary until last August, but I met him virtually in 1991 on a discussion list called Megabyte University. Okay, so Chess Rhizome is my latest project, and this is an attempt to actually visualize what a rhizomatic structure linking disparate disciplines together through an examination of a single metaphor, and that metaphor is chess. And what I'm doing is looking at the epistemological work that the metaphor of chess does in individual disciplines. And I'll see if I can demonstrate that in a moment. But I'm also, since chess rhizome is a static environment, I'm also beginning to think about more sophisticated environments like virtual reality markup language, which enables 3D environments, which would then enable you to look at not only a static map, but one that represents the historical progression of the drift of metaphors across disciplines. And now I've, I think, gone beyond the realm and more towards what I was hoping to talk to immediately, but I've decided to postpone that for now. So enough on rhizomes. Okay, so where am I? Okay. So one of the things about VRML and AutoCAD that engineers would know about is that you can create 3D environments and actually walk through them. And architects, for example, design in CAD. And you can actually buy houses online because they actually create a model virtually of the house you'd like to purchase, and you can actually walk through and to see whether you think you can redecorate it. And you can redecorate it virtually now. But that's another story. But another metaphor for the organization of information is the house. And this goes back to ancient rhetoric, as Frances Yates pointed out when she talked about the capacity of classical rhetoricians to talk for even longer than I tend to talk to, for 4 or 5 or 6 hours, by inventing their talk and arranging their talk and then memorizing it. Not memorizing it word for word, but actually memorizing the topics, the topoi, and the order in which the topoi were to be presented, simply by envisioning a house with rooms and organizing the topoi and associating them with a room and walking through the house room by room by room by room by room. I would like to think that that's what I'm doing here, but I have cribs, as you can see. I have prostheses, like an artificial arm or leg, which points to the inadequacies of memory compared to the ancient Greeks and Romans, but we have our own compensations. They don't have 6 gigabytes to play with in a laptop, but enough. Liquid architecture for 3D environments. A friend of mine named Marcos Novak, a mathematician and a virtual reality pioneer, who is now, after being associated with the University of Texas School of Architecture and UCLA School of Architecture, who has never designed a house in his life, is involved purely in virtual architecture, has created metaphors of liquid architecture where the topologies are smooth and there are folds, and you can move through these environments and decide to open up portals into other flowing spaces. And through conversations with, shall I say, knockdown, drag-out fights with him, he's now begun to embrace something that I've been pushing, which are metaphors of physics. So let me talk about metaphors of physics, and I have 3 different levels of physics metaphors that people are beginning to use now. That's been the source of my own explorations of tropes of hypertextual space. How are we doing for time? 40 minutes, yipes. Well, it's just that I've got, yeah, okay. Now, where was I? Sorry. Physics.
I think maybe you have to reverse.
I have to.
No, maybe you have to reverse to what that never step.
I'm not sure what you're saying.
Maybe you have to reverse in order to make that delay work, because it's not.
Oh, it's not working. Okay, well, it's too late now, so let's just go on. Thanks. You remember this diagram? This is a map of simple dynamical events going from the past and the future, right? But if you remember, this is an embrace of a perspective of dynamics which is reversible with respect to time, correct? That when you model mathematically dynamical systems and engineer dynamical systems, they should be able to run backwards and forwards. In other words, the math works whether the solar system is moving forwards or backwards in time, which is why we can predict when Halley's Comet is going to come again, and also cite very precisely when Halley's Comet occurred in the past, not only so we can check on Mark Twain's conceit that he entered and left life with Halley's Comet, as he would like to joke, but also to see, with respect to Chinese astronomy, etc., whether their accounting of astronomical events can map onto other cultures. Okay. Not to mention the fact that this also enables, guns to shoot cannonballs through the windows of towers at a distance of 2 miles simply by being able to freeze time, divide time into an infinite number of still moments and account for wind and trajectory and the amount of accelerant in the form of gunpowder to figure out how to get it there from here. And one of the best ways to see the reversible perspective of time is by recourse to quantum electrodynamics. This is a diagram of the simplest, I think it's the simplest subatomic particle interaction that you can see. And I'm not going to ask you to learn Feynman's electrodynamics, quantum electrodynamics, but just to see that this diagram is a diagram that makes sense whether you're going forwards or backwards in time. Here we have a photon propagating through the vacuum, which for some reason, which we could associate with something called the Lamb shift, causes the photon to break apart into an electron-positron pair. The positron moves backwards in time, electron moves forwards in time. And this electron propagates forwards in time and collides with a positron moving backwards in time, and it disintegrates, and the energy released by the disintegration produces a photon. I think I've gotten that right. Well, you can turn this diagram backwards and see that we have, a photon moving backwards in time, which which is absorbed by a positron, which then propagates through time and collides with an electron moving forwards in time. And did I get that right? I might have. I'm trying to do this too quickly. But in any case, the representation graphically of quantum electrodynamics is reversible with respect to time, and you can actually see the logic governing the behavior of subatomic particles as fundamentally reversible. And all I want to suggest is this is a powerful metaphor for hypertextual space, because all you have to do is look at this particular point and that particular point and think about them as buttons, and you can see that you can go forwards and backwards through a link in hypertextual space. So and this is the logic that works, and this is a way to think about the reversible logic of trajectory in hypertextual environments. So how do we think of links? Well, we can think of links like black holes. How many of you have been on the World Wide Web and entered a link and then ended up crashing your computer and never to be seen again as a hypertextual navigator? Well, that's when a link is a black hole, because it ain't working, folks. Okay? you end up in the elsewhere zone, to use a description from yesterday, or you end up in a singularity from which no information can emerge. And these are just metaphors. These are not real. This is a fable that we've created in order to design environments to make them useful for us. Let me get to the punchline. Cybernetics and the environments that we've created through cybernetics are projections of the way that we organize the world ourselves. And there are different sets of epistemological models for cybernetic worlds as they are for the world of physics. And my interest is in the epistemological warfare between reversible and irreversible systems in physics. So a link can take you nowhere, and your computer can crash. There's a novel by Uncle Buddy's Funhouse by John, I can't remember his name, this is terrible, McDade. John McDade designed a novel where if you enter through a link, a bomb explodes and it crashes the system and takes you outside of the novel. And then you have to go back into it. So that's a black hole designed deliberately to mess up your mind. One of the wonderful functions of avant-garde discourse, but let's not go there right now. But clearly something works with these links. And there's got to be some kind of logic, and you must remember these images from yesterday. Or maybe I didn't use them yesterday. Okay, up here is a white hole, and down here is a wormhole. And this is from John Wheeler's Geometrodynamics, which is an extended branch of general relativity dealing with multiple dimensions of reality. With a white hole, what you have is parallel universes, and you could move from one time-space geometry to another. So you enter in this way through the black hole, and then you come out in another time-space geometrical universe down here. Or there can be wormholes, like the famous one. How many of you have seen the movie Contact? That's a wormhole, where one of my favorite actresses, Jodie Foster, enters into a wormhole to go to another. Yeah, it's great. I love the sensation and what, for example, liquid architecture does. This is what Marcos Novak plays with, and he has the math to do it as well as the programming skill to invent topologies. So he's a real pioneer. But in hypertext, we have different kinds of links that we can use in HTML programming. We can use a tag, which can take us to another text, or we can use a tag to take us to another section of the same text. And I know that how many of you have built web pages? Then you know that you use different types of tags to take you down instantly to another part of the same page, or it can take you to another page. So you see, this is a metaphor for navigation. Just a metaphor, as someone said yesterday. Who's the person who said yesterday that I wanted to tease? I can't remember. Oh, I think it was Bazarov. Remember we had that conversation about just a metaphor? Yeah. You remember? Okay. So anyway, but the problem is, of course, that a lot of my critique is that there's nothing really liberating about this in any kind of cognitive sense, because, for example, here's a 2D model of a black hole, and one could argue that hypertext by itself, or the World Wide Web by itself, is relentlessly geometrical, and there is no escape from geometry and the structures of information informed by geometry, the worst of which, or the most popular of which, depending on your point of view, is the division classification system of the pyramid. Okay, so that's physics 1. Now physics 2. You remember this diagram? This is a diagram to describe the contingency of possible future directions in the history of the system. And I've actually been doing a lot of work on metaphors of phase space for hypertext design, and in fact, chess rhizome is designed according to this particular metaphor. So, to make a long story short, one of the things that hypertext novelists depend upon in order to mess with you, because they are, after all, avant-gardists, is to enable you to get lost. So there are an infinite number of novels that you can construct as you navigate through them, and there's really, I mean, there are ways of mapping the history of your participation in a novel so you can remember what reading you did and follow the same links. But there's an aleatory wandering that can occur in hypertextual space as well, which is kind of like Brownian motion. If you think of yourself as a molecule drifting through hypertextual space, there is a certain kind of contingency and chaotic nature of the experience. And my friend Espen Arseth's book, Cybertext, from Johns Hopkins, actually plays with this metaphor of aleatory movement, and he talks about ergotics. And ergotics are theories of these kinds of problems, and there's the ergodic thesis and the quasi-ergodic thesis and the non-ergodic thesis. And simply what I want to point out is that one actually can use this to describe self-organizing systems as well, so that it's not simply contingent but can self-organize. And actually this is what informed my original hypertext project, which modeled linear and recursive heuristics for the writing of arguments for associative as well as logical thinking. And this, I generated this freshman writing hypercard system to model processes of thought for my students based on the work on self-organizing systems that I had done with Prigogine, that I had worked with the work of Prigogine and Henri Atlan, and by reference to Francisco Varela and cognitive science models of self-organizing systems. And so in 1989, I thought about the metaphor and thought about recursive and self-organizing patterns that could occur if students enter and then enter again and enter again into a process of generating ideas off the top of their heads and then differentiating the directions which they could go with those thoughts in terms of rhetorical categories. Then it might be possible to use catalysis as one kind of a model for the ways that thoughts can evolve. And by catalysis, I'm referring to linear and nonlinear catalysis for those folks that understand the loose and sloppy metaphors of chemistry that I was using in order to model hypertextual environments.
How was you monitoring the students' track through this?
Oh, that was a problem. They would get lost. That's another issue. I mean, and I would love to go there. And in fact, my theoretical work and my design of phase space is an attempt to try to solve that problem. So I did not conceptualize about getting lost when I built Rhizome, the first project. And so chess rhizome, to a certain extent, is an attempt to address.
If you want to keep track whether all the places somebody has been visiting, you have to...
Right. Let me simply say that there are enabling factors of some hypertext programs and not others at that time. HyperCard could do complex processes and even timed processes, but it could not create a transcendent spot where you could get off the world. You know the American play, Stop the World, I Want to Get Off? Well, there's no function in hypertext to give you a transcendent spot where you can see a map of where you are and where you can go. Story space, which is an authoring system for writing, can do that, but it cannot have the complex trajectories that HyperCard was capable of doing. And if one of the few, well, maybe my only claim to fame is that when I designed Rhizome, it was really the first attempt to model sequences of thought. And let me just emphasize the importance of this as a principle, because what I'm suggesting is that you can guide students through steps of thought. And in fact, I have examples of these. Someone did that not just for argument, like I did, but someone did it for the design of psychological statistical studies, and another person did it for writing history. Okay, so you can actually model the cognitive steps that you have to do for heuristics in specific disciplines. And the reason why I think computers are so powerful, let me just make an editorial comment, is that you not only can guide students step by step in the sense of modeling the process for them, but because it's on the screen in front of them, you're actually giving them an element of self-consciousness so they can witness the steps that they are being guided through. Because it's external to them, they're actually witnessing self-consciously their participation in a heuristic while they're in the process of doing it, which they could not do, which is why they got lost, because they couldn't figure out which heuristic they were in at a particular moment in time. So while my hypertext stacks worked, there was a problem with it, pedagogically.
Is this leaving the student
Yes. Hello. Yes.
Hello.
Hello. Hello. Hello. Hello.
Just speak loud.
Hello.
What I wanted to say is this leaving the student a lot of leeway. His imagination is able to, and is guiding the student through. What position is this putting the student in as to developing himself?
Thank you for the Portuguese translation. I forgot to take this off. Excellent question. There's a liberating part of this, an enabling part of this, and a restricting part of this. The restricting part of this, which is what you're addressing, it is that they are being guided through my construction of a heuristic procedure, right? But the value of this is that my particular hypertext has not one, but 6 heuristics. And in each of those 6 heuristics, there are sub-heuristics. And they can hop at will from one heuristic to another. And so in addition, what's getting modeled for them is that they begin to see that heuristics, and by extension disciplines, are what Kenneth Burke, the American philosopher, calls terministic screens, which are, in a sense, rose-colored glasses to look at the world. And they can take off and put on procedures as well as points of view. And so I still think there's a sense, an enabling factor, even though there are constraints in guiding them through. And we're also talking about students who don't know how to structure their thinking in time. So they're learning for the first time, and yet at the same time, they are learning that there's more than one way to skin a cat, to use an American expression, which I think, as a theorist, is a really important thing to teach students.
Just one more question. Have you had any evaluation coming in from students, their reactions to this?
Yes, and I was just talking, I forgot this woman's, the communications professor, Brasilia, mentioned that what did the students thought, and I mentioned the fact, and I've written about this self-consciously, that the students would get lost because there wasn't a transcendent function for them to see where they were. And that had to do with a constraint on actually the software. And if I could have put in a map that would help keep track of the students, that would have helped the students a lot, but the software was not able to do that. So there are constraints as well as enabling factors. So I think you're beginning to get the idea, but let me just blow your mind No, I can't make this larger, can I? Well, this is an image of a self-organizing system called chemical scrolls, or the Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction. If you mix two chemicals in a petri dish, what will occur is a chemical reaction that will generate these structures, these dissipative structures. And these structures occur spontaneously, and they are relatively unpredictable, but the patterns remain approximately the same. And what these are a literal example of a self-organizing system at the level of chemistry. And Prigogine has written about this particular one. Well, what I'm really interested in is in tropes and drift across disciplines, and this was actually the model that I had for entering into different disciplines. But the problem is that you cannot account for time in my chest rhizome project. If we have time, I'll show it to you. But when I'm thinking about VRML environments where students can actually move through space, and you can actually give the historical account of how these tropes have propagated across disciplines through time, like a trope like self-organization across disciplinary boundaries, you can actually enable students to see how tropes drifted across disciplines, took root, to use another metaphor, and take on a life of its own in separate disciplinary environments, which is why you get these different kinds of circles here, that you get the sense that this self-organization process is also a differentiation process, which can continue to differentiate, take root, and develop in terms of how this metaphor performs epistemological baggage. So, it's only a metaphor. Remember, fables of self-organization. Now, this lets me do what I originally wanted to do, which is to talk about metaphor. Okay. So I know this is a lot, but I just wanted to move inductively from my interest in metaphor in the modeling of hypertext environments in order to do scholarly and pedagogical work to an investigation of metaphor, generally speaking, for the purposes of doing transdisciplinary studies. So I hope this isn't too much, so let me just simply use the words of Betty Davis and say, fasten your seatbelts, we may be in for a bumpy ride. So the original title of my talk was Metaphors in Science, Portals, Drift, and Parallel Processing as a Model for Transdisciplinary Approaches to Intellectual History. Quack, 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 quack. Okay, so the question is, we all want to do transdisciplinary inquiry, but how the heck do we do it? One way to do it is to establish correspondences from one domain to another. And there's a whole kind of literature out there, in literature and in science, trying to figure out how to establish relationships between domains. In literature, it's called allegory. In science, it's called analogy formation. And it turns out that you can talk about both at the same time, which I think is a really useful thing to do because it suggests that there are commonalities at the level of methodology that we can employ for the purposes of doing transdisciplinary inquiry. So, first of all, let me mention that there are 5 problems with allegory. In other words, I don't just want to simply say that we can go ahead and allegorize, we can create any kind of correspondence between this diagram and this phenomenon in culture, whether you're talking about art or philosophy or literature or social structures or whatever it is that you want to talk about. Whether you want to talk about the behavior of the stock market or traffic patterns or whatever it is that you want to talk about when you're doing an analogy between, for example, chaos theory and social structures. Okay? What I want to talk about is how can we do this rigorously and carefully? Okay? The first problem is the problem that tropes are the basis of allegory. Allegory is the narrativization of tropes. What are tropes? The four master tropes: metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, and irony. And as I would like to emphasize, I consider self-organization a master trope for our time. I have a really good friend in medieval studies and allegory who produced a whole book on the metaphor of prosopoeia, which is the metaphor of personification, which he also considers a master trope. Metaphor, strict one-to-one correspondences, metonymy, talking too loud? Too fast, okay. So, rein in the horses. This is lower, this is reining in the horses. Sorry. I hate to make it any worse than it already is for these wonderful people. The problem with theories of metaphor or tropes, metaphor is one trope. Trope is a larger category that encompasses the word metaphor. So let me use the word trope. The problem with metaphor, excuse me, I just contradicted myself. The problem with tropes is that when people have theorized about tropes, they have used tropes from physics in order to model how tropes work. Derrida, for example, in a really important essay which is neglected quite a bit called White Mythology, which has all kinds of reverberations for those of us interested in first world, third world relations and the question of colonization at the level of thought as well as political. He talks about the need to, that metaphors, and he uses the word metaphor, but I think he means tropes generally speaking, that tropes always have recourse to physis, or the physical universe, or one might even say natural law. Tropes always have recourse to natural law, whether we want them to or not, whether we are skeptical or a believer in correspondence between discourse and the natural world. The use of metaphor is the attempt to construct correspondences between the natural world and human ideation. We cannot escape from that. We can be self-conscious and skeptical about it, which is why, for example, I use the word fable to remind us that we are the authors. Caught it just in time. I was actually hoping to read this, so I'm going to have to summarize this, but maybe I can just take word for it that people have been using metaphors for the behavior of tropes from physics, at least since Nietzsche. For example, Nietzsche talked about truth as inertia, the least possible use of force, etc. And Hayden White and Harold Bloom have talked about the ways, actually Derrida in particular, about the ways in which words seem to behave like planets that revolve around a signified sun, or to make things worse, electrons around a signified nucleus. And Derrida talks about the swerve, using the word swerve from Lucretius, to talk about the problem of the fact that unpredictably a word can swerve from its orbit. Just to mention Poincaré again, the three-body problem is a description of how vulnerable dynamical systems are to moments of contingency like that could generate catastrophe. so that Jupiter could actually swerve into the sun. Well, Bloom actually talks about, Harold Bloom, the literary theory, actually uses the metaphor of tropes spiraling around into the sun as the point where we give up on metaphor. Metaphor is to keep us away from the center. Because to get into the center is to get to truth, and we cannot survive to face the truth. So solar systems or atomic systems of atoms and electrons circling around the center nucleuses are the ways in which we create systems for ourselves that hover around truth, but hover specifically because we cannot deal with and in fact there cannot be a correspondence between signified and signifier. And some people believe, as I will mention, that even scientific, mathematical, symbolic language is itself not transparent in the slightest. It cannot get us from here to there. It is itself dependent upon the tropical dimension. And I'll talk about that in a sense. The problem with this theory of metaphor, as Mark Turner has pointed out, is that, and most enemies of literary theory, for example, that it's just a bunch of bootstrapping. We can create any kind of vocabulary and any kind of nomenclature to construct any kind of world that we want, but it doesn't refer to anything, which is, I think, the greatest danger for transdisciplinary inquiry. And he says, for example, in his attack on literary theory, for example, essays by Foucault, What is an Author, or Roland Barthes, The Death of the Author, and other kinds of constructions that emphasize the pure textuality of experience. He attacks them by saying that this is all a bunch of ungrounded bootstrapping. And he wants to ground literary studies in cognitive science, in the experience, the embodied experience